welcome to this webinar. My name is Clionadh Introduction. I am the founder and CEO of ACLED, which is the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Organization. We are a conflict monitoring organization and the leading source for data and analysis on global conflict. I'll be moderating today's session where we will be discussing our latest report called 2 Years of War in Sudan, How the SAF is Gaining the Upper Hand. To walk us through the last 2 years of this war through this report, we are joined by two of the authors, Nohad Tayeb and Ali Mahmoud Ali. Nohad is an executive researcher with ACLED, where she supports various research projects and publications, particularly in Sudan. And Ali is an African researcher at ACLED, where he focuses again on the Horn of Africa, where he has been contributing to data collection. In addition to these core responsibilities, he supports various research and analysis projects across the Horn of Africa, with a focus on conflict dynamics and political developments in Sudan. We're very grateful to have both here to engage with this very timely conversation. After the presentation from both Nohad and Ali, you will have the opportunity to ask questions during a live Q&A at the end of the session. So in general, feel free to pop your questions into the Q&A function throughout the event. So this webinar is a time to go over this especially excellent report that both Nohad and Ali put together. The war in Sudan is often discussed in terms of its effect on the people on Sudan, and the costs to the Sudanese population has been both extreme and extensive. But this report has taken a little bit of a different approach, and it's looking at the conflict as how it was fought and how it is currently being fought, rather than a concentration on its victims. And this particular lens has allowed us to interrogate this war from the fighting parties, which, as many of you will know, have recently had some very pronounced changes. So last month, after almost 2 years of war, the Sudanese Armed Forces, or SAF, and its allies regained control of the presidential palace in central Khartoum, along with all of the ministries and the government buildings surrounding it. As the RSF troops withdrew from Khartoum city, a move that this group referred to as a strategic retraction, the SAF announced full control of Sudan's tri-city capital on the 26th of March. This recapture of Khartoum city has marked a watershed moment in this conflict. The SAF has now gained the upper hand, particularly in central Sudan. For those, of course, who've been following this conflict over the last 2 years, this is the first time that SAF can claim to have regained control just in general of the conflict. Khartoum's fall may seem to have unfolded quickly, especially to casual observers, but people familiar with our work and other work in Sudan know that it really represented the culmination of an offensive that began at the end of September 2024 with coordinated attacks on RSF-held positions in the tri-cities of the Khartoum state, which is Bahri, Omdurman, and Khartoum cities. SAF also recaptured the capital cities of Sennar and Al Jazeera states, forcing the RSF into an increasingly defensive position in Khartoum. SAF's campaign eventually ousted the RSF from central Sudan, and this has broken their siege on several SAF bases in Khartoum, Sennar, and North Kordofan states, and cutting vital supply routes, leaving RSF troops surrounded by SAF in central Khartoum. So a very, I would say, dynamic military situation, which is important to review in order to understand how SAF was able to do that, but also what the likely continuation of this is going to be. Overall, since this offensive began, as I mentioned in the end of September, SAF and its allies have regained over 430 locations across central and southern Sudan. And this report, which I encourage everybody to read, examines 3 very important shifts within Sudan's warring camps that played a critical role in turning the tide this way. One is SAF's enhanced recruitment to address a chronic manpower shortage. Second is the emergence of new alliances between the armed groups. And third, of course, is the fragmentation of the RSF. While some areas of Khartoum state remain contested, especially in the west and south of Omdurman, the war in Sudan has entered a new phase, and shifts to the western and southern regions of the country, particularly northern Darfur, Kordofan, and the Blue Nile regions, are now the front lines. And with that, I will pass it off to Ali to start us off. Thank you very much.
Thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Ali Mahmoud Ali. I'm working with ACLED in the Global Data Collection team with focus on Sudan and also contributing to the analysis project, different times project with ACLED. Today we're going to discuss how the war that erupted between the Sudan Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Forces in April 2023 as disagreements during the framework agreement that aim to restore the democratic transition in Sudan, and now it's completed 2 years. There were several factors unfolding across these 2 years, determining how the conflict have been going. It's mainly local agenda and militias, and also the political and armed actors and regional backers for the warring parties. ACLED has recorded 11,000, more than 11,000 political violence events with more than 37,000 reported fatalities, mostly concentrated, as you can see in the graph here. Khartoum is a state that highly contested and with the highest fatalities, followed by North Darfur and Al Jazeera. As we can see on the map here, also that Khartoum is in the center of Sudan, and Al Jazeera is in the south from it, and North Darfur is highly contested because it's lay between different supply routes and routes of reinforcements of troops, and in the Darfur region also. Its location near to Chad and Libya make it highly contested. Next slide, please. The violence targeting civilians in these 2 years have been increased, as we can see here in the first map on the left, that the violence have been conducted, targeting civilians have been conducted by SAF, largely in Khartoum and Darfur region, as these regions are held by RSF, and these targeting of civilians mainly were airstrikes by SAF, while on the other hand, we see the violence increase significantly that conducted by the RSF. As we see, even though the conflict subsided, the armed clashes subsided between the two war parties in many areas, specifically in Al Jazeera, it's increased significantly as the RSF attacking the communities, and because it's not like later on we'll talk about the RSF and the RSF fragmentation, but the RSF and their huge networks of allies with local militias could not control them. And we see here most of the violence concentrated in Khartoum and Khartoum and Jazeera and Sinnar, and also North Darfur, as the violence targeting civilians is correlated with the armed clashes and the battles between the two warring parties. Next slide, please. The airstrikes, as the SAF have faced like a massive shortage of manpower since the first days of the conflict. It relied highly on the airstrikes, and the SAF airstrikes were targeting mainly the RSF positions in Khartoum and Al Jazeera in the first year, and also the RSF positions in the Kurdifed region and in the Darfur region. While in the second year of the conflict, we see an increase a significant increase in the airstrikes, as both of the war parties were able to receive fighter jets and for the SAF, and both of them received fighter drones, which mainly used by the RSF in targeting infrastructure in in northern state and River Nile state, also the dam in Merawi, and also the power stations in White Nile and other areas. And in Darfur, it's only used in Al-Fashir, as Al-Fashir is still held by the SAF and their allies, Darfur Joint Forces, and the RSF regained or gained strategic drones that can fuel for long time, and also have precise targeting of the positions. Next slide, please. So we were in a situation for the long time of the war. The RSF was holding the upper hand in the controlling all of Al Jazeera except the Managil region and all of Sinai region, and most of Khartoum. The SAF were sieged in their bases, and the links between their troops were cut by the RSF. And during the period between September and March, has significantly changed. As Clionadh mentioned, the SAF were able to regain more than 430 locations in the central regions and in North Kordofan. Also, there is a multi-front offensive in North Darfur that enabled SAF to bring reinforcement of troops reinforcements to Fashir in October. So we try to analyze how the SAF became able to do such offensive, while previously most of the SAF offensive were unsuccessful to regain territories or link their troops on the besieged bases. I will talk about the operation in Khartoum, then Al Jazeera and Sinnar, and then we will talk about the factors that enabled SAF for regaining the central regions. Next slide, please. So in Khartoum, the RSF, since the first days of the clashes, cut the links between the SAF troops. So every SAF base in Khartoum were isolated from the others and besieged due to they were overwhelmed by the RSF manpower, and SAF during that time were lacking and having shortage of manpower. So mostly of more for a year and a half, the RSF were holding the upper hand in Khartoum, and the SAF only managed to link their troops between North and Southern Lebanon in the west. And due to the Khartoum geography as an urban area, whoever control the bridges and control the higher building will manage to succeed in their operations. So the River Nile made Khartoum three cities in this separated by the River Nile into three areas, Durman and Bahri and Khartoum. So the RSF were having two links between Durman city, which is in the west, and Khartoum and Bahri through Shambat Bridge, which was bombed by SAF in October 2023, and the RSF by this became have only one route out from Khartoum to bring forces or even to throw. So they only have Jabal Awliya Bridge in the southern Khartoum, and SAF held the other bridges partially or fully. So the SAF offensive, in order to gain control over Khartoum, began on 26th of September. They crossed three bridges from Omdurman to Bahri and Khartoum city to Khartoum, two bridges to Khartoum city, and from north Omdurman to Bahri city, where they managed to link their troops on the third day of the operation with the Women Corps troops in Qadar. It's a neighborhood in northern Bahri, and then they pushed the RSF southward until they managed to break the siege in January on the Signal Corps base and also the General Command Headquarters in central Khartoum. And also the troops managed to push from Al Jazeera and the RSF troops in the East Nile locality and control the bridges of Sober Bridge and also the Machia bridges, and then they encircled the RSF until they managed to push them away from Bahri Sisi and Khartoum city totally by the end of March. Okay. Until the end of March, they regained fully control of Khartoum city and Bahri city, while the Omdurman is still contested as there are RSF troops in southern and western Omdurman neighborhood, and the area is like where is the RSF withdrawing from Khartoum to Omdurman through Jabal Awliya Bridge. The SAF fully linked all the troops and the bases in Khartoum, and they pushing the RSF westward as the RSF withdrawal. Next slide, please. While in Al Jazeera and Sinnar city, the fall of the fall of Jabal Moya, which is a strategic location in northern Sinnar state, between also near to the southern Al Jazeera state. The SAF regaining control of Jabal Moya enabled them to regain control over Sinjar city, which is the capital of Sinnar state, and then pushing the RSF southward and encircling them. Then after that, concurrently, the SAF managed to open multiple front lines in Al Jazeera because of the Al Jazeera irrigation infrastructure. The movement of troops were challenging, and the SAF have launched different and multiple offensives where they were easily ambushed by the RSF until September, where the many factors happens, and Nuhad will discuss more about this. In the alliances that enabled SAF to open multiple front lines in eastern Jazeera locality and the southern Jazeera locality, enabled them to regain control of Wad Madani, which is the capital of Al Jazeera state, in 11 January 2025, and then they started to push the RSF northward toward Al Khartoum city or Khartoum state, as the RSF from all these regions, Sinnar and Khartoum and Al Jazeera, the RSF, they have only one way out is through Jabal Awliya Bridge. So the forces managed to push the RSF northward until they regain fully control of Al Jazeera in late March. Next slide, please. So what have been changed during this offensive is we analyze it into three factors: the enhancement of the recruitment that the SAF enabled SAF to have to address the shortage of manpower, and the alliances formation between different rebel groups and the SAF paramilitaries. And also the third factor was the fragmentation within the RSF ranks. And I will talk about enhancements of recruitment, and then Muhad will talk about the alliances formation and fragmentation within the RSF. Next slide, please. So in order to address the shortage of manpower, the SAF have been calling for mobilization since August 2023, but they were it's met with hesitations and limited responses until the fall of Wad Madani, which is trigger panic over SAF controlled areas and communities in these areas, because they saw how the civilians were targeted, and Wad Madani, in the night of the fall of Wad Madani, there is uh, there were like a panic across SAF states. And also, since then, SAF managed to open training camps across their uh, their control areas, and Zagawa ethnic group declared war against the RSF, and the South outsourced the like managing of Zagawa and other mobilizations uh, that bring volunteers and bring uh, increase the SAF manpower. I'll pass it to Nahad now, and she will complete.
Thanks, Ali. So to continue, in addition to the expanded recruitment initiatives, a critical factor that enabled the army to regain the central region was that it expanded its network of allies and also welcomed RSF defectors. So if we look at this graph, we can see that after 2 years of conflict, most of the armed groups in Sudan have chosen to take sides, with the exception of one group that still remains neutral, the Sudan Liberation Movement, an army led by Abdel Wahid al-Nur, which controls territories in Darfur. And if we look at the SAF allies, we can see that they are mostly former rebel groups under the Darfur Joint Forces, as well as Islamist militias such as Al-Barra ibn Malik Brigade, and also some ethnic militias. And if we look at the RSF's allies, although in the beginning of the conflict in 2023, the RSF mostly relied on ethnic and communal militias, it now also successfully lured in some of the Darfur groups that split from the Darfur Joint Forces. Now, these groups which we see here outlined in gray were groups that were formerly neutral in the conflict, but joined the RSF after it announced the formation of a parallel government in February of this year. Most importantly, the RSF also announced its alliance with the Sudan People Liberation Movement North, led by Abdelaziz al-Hilo, which controls territories in South Kordofan and the Blue Nile regions. And this alliance in particular has extended a lifeline to the RSF, as it's already benefiting from this, from the SPLM North networks across the border with South Sudan, potentially opening new supply lines for the group and allowing it to regroup in the southern regions. If we go to the next slide, please. So in this map, we can see the areas of activity of the SAF's core allies. The Darfur Joint Forces, which joined the SAF since November 2023, are mostly active in North Darfur, but still they managed to disrupt the RSF's key supply routes through the northwestern border, which also played a role in enabling the SAF's advances in the central region, considering that it distracted the RSF through clashes around Al-Fashir. It also mobilized the Zaghawa ethnic group to defend Al-Fashir and supported in establishing training camps in the eastern region of the country, which Ali mentioned earlier, supported the SAF's shortage of infantry. And meanwhile, in the central region, the Al-Barra ibn Malik Brigade, which has been a SAF ally since the beginning of the conflict. It's an Islamist militia that was a part of the Popular Defense Forces, which was a paramilitary during Bashir's regime. And it supported the SAF's front lines in Khartoum more recently. The third and more recent alliance is the Sudan Shield Forces, which defected from the RSF in October 2024. And this defection is considered to be one of the most significant events that shifted the tide to the SAF's advantage, because it enabled it to regain a Jazeera state. And it was shortly after the Jabal Moya, the SAF gaining Jabal Moya region in Sinnar, which was mentioned by Ali. If we go to the next slide, please. Yes, here we can see on this map the areas of activity of the Sudan Shield Forces during the past 6 months. which are mostly in Al Jazeera and Khartoum. So we can see that the recent defection of this group played a major role in the SAF's recapture of Al Jazeera state in February 2025. And it also supported its offensives in Khartoum, particularly in the eastern locality of Sharq al-Nil, which borders the eastern Al Jazeera region, which is also where most of the group's members are actually from. This is why the same group was also how the RSF gained Al Jazeera back in 2023. And then after their defection, the SAF was able to regain it. So what we can conclude from these events is that the carefully cultivated alliances in 2024 placed the SAF in a strong position to neutralize the RSF's allies, particularly in the central region. Next slide, please. Okay, another major factor that also contributed to the SAF's advances is that the fragmentation of the RSF during 2024. So if we look at this graph here, we can see that the SAF's advances in September 2024 actually coincided with a trend of infighting in the RSF, which began around August 2024. Most infighting events were in Khartoum, Darfur, and Al Jazeera, the conflict hotspots. And after a closer inspection of the nature of these events, it was clear to us that the clashes were most often related to ethnic affiliation or refusal to adhere to top-level commands. And this, we had many examples of this in Al Jazeera, such as disputes over appointments in the region. And of course, these events culminated in the defection of Kekel, the leader of the Sudan Shield Forces, which I just talked about, in October 2024. Following his defection, the RSF arrested many members of the RSF and its civilian administration, which were appointed earlier, in Wad Madani, the capital of Al Jazeera, accusing them of siding with the defectors. And of course, this was a reason to, which it also further increased the divisions among the RSF ranks in the region. There were also signs of resistance to top-level commands in Khartoum, because we saw many clashes. Some of the clashes between RSF members were in Soba prison in Khartoum, and they were because some members of the RSF wanted to free other members of the RSF, which were arrested by the group's Negative Phenomena Committee, which is an internal police that the RSF leadership set up to combat misdemeanors. So these infighting incidents, if we go to the next slide, please. These incidents can be explained mostly by the RSF's recruitment strategy, because it relied on alliances with ethnic and communal militia leaders and mercenaries with experience in combat. Some of them fought in previous Sudan conflicts, as well as outside of Sudan in Libya, for example. So this resulted in a kind of decentralized structure where the RSF has mostly operated as a coalition of local militias rather than one coherent army. And this allowed its members a level of autonomy, which was also key to the RSF's early successes, because it was able to quickly expand to many regions in Sudan in 2023. And it also operated markets and local economies, and each group had its independent taxation strategies, which enabled the RSF to dominate access routes in and outside of cities, and also isolate the SAF-controlled regions. However, the infighting trend that we just saw indicates that the RSF still struggles to maintain a coherent chain of command. So this also played a role in the RSF's failure to establish a reliable form of governance and achieve a level of security in its regions, at least for the first 2 years of the conflict, a level of security that enabled residents to to go back to these regions even after the clashes subsided. And over 68% of the violence targeted civilians recorded by ACLED since the conflict began was committed by the RSF, indicating that there's a higher tolerance for criminal activity in areas under its control. And this is also because the RSF's allied militias, of course, rely on quick economic gains, and they are mostly compensated through war spoils and taxation, which also intensifies the internal competition between the very local militia leaders. Next slide, please. Okay, so I will just conclude by going over some of the trajectories that we're expecting for the conflict in as it enters its third year. There are unfortunately no realistic signs of de-escalation or a ceasefire prospect. In fact, we're seeing signs of upgraded military equipment as both sides continue to receive military aid from external actors. And during the past month, ACLED recorded a few incidents where the RSF was able to shoot down SAF aircrafts in Niala and Al Fashir. And this indicates that that indeed the group is or has upgraded its air defense system more recently, which will probably also fuel the conflict even more. With the SAF now controlling the central region, the conflict is still far from over. It's just going to enter a new phase as it shifts west to the Darfur region and south to Kordofan and the Blue Nile regions. And indeed, the RSF has escalated its attacks in North Darfur. And over the past weekend, we saw that the RSF launched massive assaults on the two largest camps for internally displaced people in Darfur, the Abu Shok and Zamzam camps, near Al Fashir, which host around 700,000 IDPs, causing hundreds of civilian casualties and targeting civilian infrastructure. So we're already seeing signs of ethnic-based violence against civilians in these regions. And now Al Fashir is completely under siege by the RSF. Of course, the RSF aims to gain Al Fashir so that it can eventually control the entire Darfur region. Al Fashir is the capital of North Darfur. It's the only city that's still outside of the RSF control in Darfur. And now we are seeing that there's a high risk of the conflict also spilling over to neighboring countries because the RSF has already engaged in some clashes in South Sudan in March of this year, aided by its alliance with the Sudan People Liberation Movement North. And as a result, the tensions between the SAF and neighboring countries like Chad and South Sudan are also rising, as the SAF accuses them of supporting the RSF. And finally, there's also an increased risk of the division of the country, especially since last Tuesday, the RSF announced the structure of its parallel government, which it plans to establish in its regions of control with its newly formed alliances. So this moves the country also a step closer to the de facto division that we are expecting to see from the formation of such a government. And as the conflict drags on, both the SAF and RSF will be faced with the challenge of balancing these allies and their competing agendas. And also the involvement of several local militias increases the likelihood that armed groups will further fragment into multiple militias, making the prospect of a ceasefire even more difficult, particularly as both sides continue to receive military support from abroad. And with that, I will conclude our presentation and hand it back to Clionadh for questions.
Fantastic. Thank you both. That was really excellent. We've got many wonderful questions here, but I'm going to take the opportunity to just maybe sum up, asking you to sum up some of the important points you made. Nohad, could you explain why Darfur continually ends up being a place in which Sudanese conflicts are both fought first and last. That would be maybe a good way to understand about how the trajectory of Sudanese conflicts can go in many different directions, but they always return to Darfur at some point. And Ali, there was a really great question here about the stability of the alliances on the SAF end have, in comparison to the RSF, seemed a little bit more stable, although that may not be the case. And I'm curious about your thoughts about how likely it is that the current conglomeration of alliances that SAF has built will continue into the future. So you can choose who would like to go first.
Okay, I can maybe answer the first question about Darfur. That's of course a good question. The first aspect that we need to consider is that Darfur, considering the history, the very long history of conflict in the region, is even before the conflict, it's been a highly militarized region. There are many armed groups that were active in Darfur. Some of them joined the government in 2020 after signing the Juba Peace Agreement. But then even these signatories split now. Some of them are with the SAF and some are with the RSF. And of course, we also saw that there's still one neutral group. So the other reason is that the RSF itself is the core groups that form the RSF are mostly from the Darfur region. And so that's considered to be the stronghold of the RSF. And the SAF is therefore still conducting airstrikes in some of the RSF strongholds, such as Niala in South Darfur, and also the areas surrounding Al-Fashir to protect or defend Al-Fashir from the RSF attacks. So I guess the answer would also be that as the conflict shifts to Darfur, even if there's a prospect of a ceasefire or some sort of agreement between the two main warring parties, which are the RSF and the SAF, there's still a high risk that all of these other multiple groups that are active in the region still have very high stakes in the Darfur region. So it would not be easy for them to kind of just let go or just enter the agreement with the SAF or the RSF, because they also need to secure the interests of their own constituents. And yeah, I'll pass it to Ali.
For the SAF alliances, I think like we saw like more fragmentation within the RSF than in the SAF alliances in the past 2 years, and that's largely due that the SAF control the political power and also the long experience of SAF in SAF, like within the counterinsurgency campaign. That's why we saw most of the like former rebel groups are sided with SAF, except few of them, as they have access to power through their alliances with SAF, as we see that when, like for example, Jibril and Minawi, who are commander of the GEM and the SLM rebel groups, they managed to perceive their power within the transitional government, while the civilians who were not like allied with SAF, they were like dismissed from the transitional government. And like during the war, the political actor siding with the group that managed to mobilize power and resources and could provide them something to fulfill their political interest and to perceive their gains and give them a future. But since the RSF now is like receiving military aid from regional actors and backers, and they are attempting to form a better government in their control areas. We saw for the Al-Hilu, for example, the SPLM commander and like align with the RSF, which is like make it hard to predict how the trajectories of the conflict will be in the future, especially with these new alliances formation in the RSF side.
That's really helpful. So, Ali, would you say that you're expecting SAF to gather more alliances given their recent successes because they're a better longer term bet to those on the ground rather than RSF's maybe more shorter term opportunistic alliance structure?
While yes, was like before the RSF announced their government in Nairobi, and now like forging alliances with SPLM, who has controlling territories in South Kordofan and Blue Nile, which has gave the RSF a space to operate in these regions, while previously they couldn't, like they have limited operations there in Blue Nile and in South Kordofan. And this is like because like if even though the SAF was like regaining the central regions, now the RSF are advancing toward Al Fashir and also advancing in South Kordofan and United States. So it's could not like be predicted how they manage these alliances, who will the alliances like who will have the like stronger alliances, and who will like we will expect shifting from even like the current SAF allies could if the for example if the Fajr fall to RSF, we could expect some of the rebel groups, Darfur rebel groups, become neutral or shift to RSF side. And it's not the
Thanks, Ali. That's really helpful. I'm very sorry for the balloons, everybody. For some reason, all of my Zoom calls end up being covered in balloons. Actually, Ali, I'm going to come back to you in a little bit about the possibility of people here asking in the questions about an RSF rebound and how that might look. Because as you both noted, this is not the end game. It's just a new phase and what an RSF rebound might look like. But before that, Nohad, could you speak to both the rumor and the reality of the external support for RSF, I'd say primarily, but also for SAF, because many people have linked their various fortunes to whether or not there is significant external support for them and who might be involved and what evidence there is of that.
Yes, I guess maybe throughout the beginning of the conflict, it was a bit unclear the support or the level of support by external parties. But now, more recently, I think there is much more evidence, particularly most of it was also presented in the recent hearing in the International Court of Justice, where the Sudanese government presented some of the evidence that it had for the UAE backing the RSF and sending some military equipment through some of its regional allies, such as Chad, particularly the Umjeres airport. And there are many reports that that also include such evidence. And for the SAF, there's also evidence or many reports also indicating the SAF supporters to be mostly Egypt and Iran, as well as Turkey has also sent some military aid to the SAF. Yeah, so I think what we're seeing so far is that the involvement of external actors remains to continue. And there was also a conference this week in London where some of the international actors convened, although without the presence or the attendance of Sudanese parties. But it's such a conference said that the objective was to kind of reach a contact point between all of these different regional actors. But unfortunately, the Arab countries did not reach an agreement in that case. So this also indicates that there's still no prospect of any ceasefire soon.
Thanks very much. Ali, the question was about the RSF rebound and what that might look like and how likely you think it might be and where.
So the RSF now expanded in North Darfur by the northern state. They controlling Adrum area and also Malha region where the SAF has presence. And this will expose the northern state to RSF from the north. And we saw the RSF has still West Kordofan as a stronghold. And this new coalition with the SPLM and other so the Tahir Hajar forces and Hadi Idris forces in Darfur. The RSF, if they gain control of Al-Fashir, they will move eastward to northern Kordofan after they secure to secure also to participate in the South Kordofan with the forces of SPLM. And the other regions will be targeted with this newly received fighter drones, as we see the RSF has destabilized the region by targeting the Merewi Dam and power stations in northern and river Nile states, and they will push towards to controlling north and southern Kurdistan, and they will have attempting to have southern and western regions and contesting the central region again after securing these regions.
Thank you very much to you both. I've got another selection of questions, but first I'm actually going to ask Jalale, who is the person who heads our Horn of Africa work, because there was a question here about what we make of the alleged support of SAF and RSF by the TPLF and the federal government of Ethiopia. They generally don't support the same groups, just so everybody knows. And generally conflicts influence in regional stability and restarting the Tigray war due to growing tensions. We have a lot of opinions about that here at ACLED. And then following that, Ali, if you could take a question around the control of vital areas within Sudan, in particular, whether it's mining or, for example, water infrastructure, and how that has played out in the conflict. And Nohad, I would really love if you could discuss the other surrounding areas, whether it's Chad and South Sudan, and how politics in both states might be influencing some of the movements, especially in Kordofan and Darfur. But if that's all right with everybody, but let's start with Jalale.
Thank you, Clionadh. So we know that during the Northern Ethiopia conflict between 2020 and 2022, over 200 ethnic Tigrayan soldiers who used to be members of the Ethiopian Defense Force serving under the UN peacekeeping mission in Sudan. They decided to stay in Sudan as a refugee and didn't want to return. Both the RSF and the SAF has accused members of these Tigrayans as a TPLF member supporting either SAF, accusing them supporting the RSF, and RSF vice versa. These are soldiers who are trained to sniper shots and so on. So the possibility of these remaining soldiers to be involved is high, but this is not confirmed by a third party. But they are present in Sudan as a refugee, and there is a high possibility. How the Sudan conflict might trigger another round of conflict in Tigray, I don't see it being linked to the Sudan conflict in Tigray, because the Western Tigray, the Wolkite area and so on, is still controlled by pro-Amhara, or it's outside of the control of TPLF. So there is no direct link between Sudan and TPLF. The border is controlled by this group, pro-Amhara group. And ENDF, the Ethiopian Defense Force, have also reported several intercepting different weapons. And these weapons, it's not clear whether they were being transported to TPLF or to Tigray region or to Amhara region. but there is a high probability that they were being transported to Amhara region, because the Amhara region, where Fano militias are still fighting with the government, have a direct border link with Sudan, which is not protected. So the weapons might be entering through Sudan. So this is the only links we have when it comes to Sudan and Ethiopia. The Ethiopian government seems to support both, because when the Hamditi also traveled to Ethiopia at some point, the Prime Minister Abiy also traveled to the Red Sea state, meeting with the head of the SAF. But at this moment, it seems like it's supporting SAF, or the current government recognized by most foreign countries. Ethiopia also participated in the recent, I think yesterday or the day before yesterday, the meeting in London to discuss the possibility of ceasefire and how to assist Sudan recover and stop the war. So Ethiopia is one of the stakeholders. Back to you, Claire, or back to Ali.
Yes, and Ali, did you want to talk about the domestic infrastructure that is important in shaping the geography of the conflict?
Well, as I said, and we have recorded in our data, most of infrastructure have been targeted by drone strikes or artillery shellings and so on. So most of the Sudan now is outage of power, and also this is affecting the telecommunication, and also it's impacting the experience more than the armed groups. And there is no any prospects like this will be they will not reach an agreement on not targeting vital infrastructure or so on. And also about the mining and other natural resources, both of the war parties depend on gold mining, and I think I came across a report that mentioning that the gold mining exports, the gold exports increased during the last year compared to the 2023. So both of them, in order to gain weapons or ammunition or so on, they have to continue the mining operations of gold in northern Sudan and the Red Sea state for South, and in South Darfur for the RSF. Back to you, Clionadh.
Thanks very much, Ali. That's super helpful. Nohad, it was about the surrounding area. There's some questions about Kenya, about South Sudan, and of course about Chad. All with very different types of relationships.
Yeah. So I think the relationship now of the Sudanese government with neighboring countries is the tension is really rising, and the reason for that is that Chad, for instance, being an ally of the UAE, which is a supporter of the RSF, is also being accused of supporting the RSF through its land routes, which, although the UAE denied such involvement, but there is increasing evidence that the land routes between the Chad-Sudan border are, of course, enabled by Chad and supports the RSF. But this is also complicated given that some of the SAF's allies, the Darfur Joint Forces, and also their constituents, which are mostly from the Zaghawa ethnic group, which is also the ethnic group of some of the ruling elites in Chad. So this also complicates the situation in terms of Chad's also its internal politics. And when it comes to South Sudan, the risk is even higher because the Sudan People Liberation Movement North, led by Al-Hilu, which is now the RSF's ally, also has long historical ties with the South Sudanese regime. And of course, they were previously one group, which split at some point to become the SPLM North in Sudan and the SPLM in South Sudan. So the clashes that we saw in South Sudan, where the RSF was involved, were between the RSF and some of the opposition parties in South Sudan. So this also indicated that the RSF is now kind of supporting the South Sudanese regime in its own political turmoil that's happening in South Sudan, which could also urge the SAF to take a side even within the South Sudanese conflict. And in terms of Kenya, the Sudanese government also accused Kenya of supporting the RSF, particularly after it hosted the meeting of the RSF allies in Nairobi in February of this year, where the RSF announced the formation of its government. So this also positioned Kenya in a situation where it's seemingly aligning with the RSF. And back to you, Clionadh.
Well, thank you very much. I think we're actually at our time, despite the fact that there are still some very interesting questions in the Q&A box, but we will, I promise, get to all of them. If not directly, then of course we will email people. There's the report link has also been included here. I want to thank everybody for their attention to this excellent presentation by Nohad and Ali, and the report itself, which is a really fantastic review of many of the concepts spoken about here today. We are, of course, going to keep up our review and monitoring of the Sudanese situation. We certainly hope for a much better year ahead, although based on what Nohad and Ali said, we're not likely to see one. So please do check back with us about updates on the Sudanese situation, which, as I mentioned, we will keep a very sharp eye on. Thank you, Ali. Thank you, Nohad. Thank you, Jalale. And thank you for the ACLED team for putting it together.